Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's session. My name is Mark Rye. I'm the VP of Sales with Perram Corporation. And today, together with Barclay Blair from ViaLumina, we're going to be talking about solving shared drives. It's a topic that Perram Corporation certainly spends a lot of time talking about and working on, as does ViaLumina. So hopefully you find the information today beneficial. A few items to note before we get started. For those who are new to GoToMeeting, you can expand and minimize the GoToMeeting sidebar with the orange arrow in the top left corner of that screen. If you expand it, though, there's a question and a chat section available. So throughout the presentation, feel free to document any questions that you may have into the questions section, and then we'll be checking that periodically and come back to that to address those. Primarily, we'll get to them at the end, but if things pop in amongst the presentation, then it makes sense to pick them up earlier, we'll do so. At this point, we're ready to get started, so I'm going to introduce Barclay Blair. Barclay's the president of ViaLumina. ViaLumina is an information governance consulting firm. Certainly, Barclay is a thought leader in the area of information governance. And one of the biggest issues facing many organizations out there is how do we get a handle on our shared drives. So I'll turn it over to Barclay to get the presentation going, and I'll come back in later on.
Great, Mark. Well, thank you very much, and thanks to everyone for joining. I'm actually excited to talk about shared drives this morning. That gives you maybe some insight into how exciting my life is, but I actually find with our clients that this continues to be one of the most challenging aspects of their information governance program. You think we'd have this stuff figured out by now, but in the vast majority of cases we don't. In fact, I've seen very few companies get this right. And I'm going to walk us through in a couple of minutes kind of a typical scenario, what we see with our clients when they go about trying to tackle this problem and some of the pitfalls that they come across, and then those will feed into the tips that we provide to you today as well. You know, we've helped clients with this problem many, many times. Mark has as well, and so what we're going to share with you today is just some, what we see is really practical guidance on how to go after solving this problem. I don't think it's rocket science, but it actually can be very complex and challenging from a cultural perspective as well, which is often the most difficult part of it. What's interesting about the shared drive problem, I think, is that it's kind of emblematic of the information governance problem as a whole. Well, why do I say that? Well, I think first, it's nobody ever really decided to use shared drives, at least not in the way that we use them today. So that means that we didn't really think through the long-term legal implications of using them, the business, or even the technical implications. And that's kind of an endemic problem across many environments and platforms that we're trying to govern. I think second, this kind of organic approach to using shared drives really has created a free-for-all culture in most organizations. So, employees aren't used to having rules in this space, and it's very, very difficult to change that. We struggle with that in a number of environments, email probably being the best example, but it happens in the shared drive environment. It's very difficult to, once the horse is out of the barn, to try and get the horse back in and impose a set of rules on them. So we'll talk about what that challenge means in real life and how we can go after that. I think another problem is that no one's really in charge of shared drives typically. I mean, other than from an IT administration perspective, nobody owns the content. And so that makes it it's kind of a governance void, right? It's hard to impose order in an environment when you don't even have kind of a structure to even impose rules in the organization. And finally, I think that we also failed with shared drives to truly think through well, what might happen one day if we want to get more sophisticated when it comes to managing unstructured content and maybe move to a content management environment. So here we are sitting with all of this volume of content in our shared drives. I wanted to just quickly show you, we had completed a survey recently. Mark, do I have control on those slides?
Yeah.
Doesn't seem to be advancing. I see you moving. Okay. Let's just go to the next one. So we did a survey late last year, the eDiscovery Journal, around issues, and we asked them about what kind of benefits would you expect to see from an information governance program, and we asked people, well, how much of the content in your enterprise do you think is eligible for deletion? So how much of it do you think is outdated or unnecessary content, and how much of it do you think is duplicate? And the numbers are, I guess I've been in this business long enough to not be shocked by these numbers, but it's validation of what we see every day in our practice. And I think we all intuitively know, even without conducting the survey, is that we have a huge percentage of stuff out there that really has absolutely no business value to us, and I think a lot of that stuff, in our experience, actually sits in the shared drive environment. So the shared drive environment, has, as we know, it has very rudimentary / no ability to really control what happens. We have very little ability, so as a result, it kind of becomes a bit of a cesspool of unorganized and outdated non-business content. This is another stat that came out of the survey that over 3/4 said that at least a third of information would go away if they had some mechanism to do that in a defensible means. And so we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like as part of the program when we go through our tips. So, what is the shared drive problem? Well, I kind of laid out what I think are some of the causes. In practice, what it looks like is we've got lots of content that's unorganized or poorly organized. Typically, we've got a mix of personal and business stuff. We've got content that, if we have a retention schedule, could have been disposed of long ago. Of course, there's no good way to automatically apply a retention schedule to the shared drive environment, so it's not surprising that we end up with a whole bunch of this old content. So some of our clients are looking to solve the shared drive problem incrementally. In other words, they're looking to just, clean it up, but continue to use it either as an exclusive or as one of the environments that people work in. And so sometimes the shared drive problem or fixing the shared drive problem is defined as, let's just reorganize it. Let's reorganize it. Let's put in place a standard file plan. Let's get rid of the junk, and then let's set some rules moving forward. Often, as I say, this is an incremental approach to ultimately most of our clients move to a more managed environment, content management system, or so on. But often shared drives continue to exist side by side with those environments as well. Other times, the shared drive problem is let's move this stuff out of the shared drive environment. Let's turn off shared drives, and let's start to control our content in SharePoint or one of the enterprise ECM environments. And so that's a similar problem to shared drive reorganization, but it adds some new wrinkles. And typically here, and I'm going to talk about this in our little case study in a second, typically here, one of the biggest challenges is nobody allocates enough time or enough money to the migration process. And everybody starts off with high ideals about what's going to happen. They're going to clean everything up. It's going to be nice and organized when it finally ends up in the ECM. And, of course, they run out of time. They run out of money. And we move this stuff from basically one pile to another. And that's pretty common, and we'll talk about that now, actually. So one of the things I wanted to kind of take you through is kind of an aggregate case study from our experiences in helping our clients with this problem. And I'll just kind of walk you through the scenario, and then we'll talk about some of the problems that typically arise. And I'd be very surprised if most of you haven't experienced some version of this problem. So, in our case study, we have John, who's an IT manager at a mid-sized oil and gas company, and he's been given the job of migrating shared drive content into SharePoint. So the company's decided they're going to implement SharePoint. They're going to make it kind of the baseline content management environment, and in 12 to 18 months, they're going to turn off shared drive, or at least restrict them to some very limited use. So John's been given the task of doing that, of putting in place the program, the plan, the software to do the migration. They've got multiple terabytes of files stored across the enterprise in shared drive. So he has a budget to purchase and customize a tool that can crawl and index the shared drive environment, identify duplicates and file types that can't go into SharePoint. So he runs that tool, and he gets all of these beautiful and wonderful, voluminous reports of what is in the shared drive environment and what kind of files they have, what volume there is, what things are likely duplicates, and so on. So the technical piece of his project goes fairly smoothly. He's able to present that information. He's got it ready. He's got these comprehensive reports, but then the project starts to fall apart. And why does it start to fall apart? Well, the first problem John runs into is that there's actually no person or no group of people in a department that has any knowledge or authority about deleting files. Nobody that has the ability to actually pull the trigger. So, there might be someone in the engineering department, for example, that's been there for 15 years. They have good knowledge about what this stuff is, but even they can't remember what the content, there's projects in the departmental drive that they have no knowledge of, and they have no idea whether they have any value. So there's no authority matrix, there's no governance in place to actually easily present the information that John has to somebody to say, look, can we get rid of this stuff? The second problem he runs into is that basically managers across the company have more or less told him that he's crazy, that there's no way they're going to allow their employees to waste time going through files to decide which ones to keep and which ones to throw away. John had estimated that it might take a couple of hours using this tool for employees to go through that process. Even he has to kind of admit that that's probably way off, and it's probably much longer than that. Even if he starts to add up 4 or 5 hours per employee across thousands of employees, it comes to a very big number, and no one's willing to accept that. Even if managers, you could get the managers to accept that, he's got the problem that of will it happen in the time frame that he needs it to happen, and probably not. So that's another problem he has. Third problem is that he wants to get rid of stuff. He wants to identify and get rid of duplicates. He wants to classify information into a standardized file plan. But frankly, like many other companies, John's company's policies are out of date. They're nicely written. They're in a binder. They're sitting on a shelf, but they've never really been updated for the digital world. So there's really a void. There's no, as you talked about in number one, there's nobody in the governance structure that really has the authority to pull the trigger on this, and certainly there's a lack of, here in this problem, a lack of policy guidance as well. Legal woes, so again, very typical problem. When lawyers in John's company find out about John's program, they get a little excited, and they say, look, you can't just start deleting and moving these files because some of these files are responsive to ongoing litigation. And, if you start deleting this stuff willy-nilly, it opens us up to civil penalties, criminal penalties. So don't make a move without our input. And the problem there is, like at most companies, there's actually no central database of current litigation matters at the company. that John can access to say, look, this is the stuff that can't be thrown away, or this is the stuff that needs to be preserved and we need to protect as part of this project. So there's no place for him to go there. So some of this, I'm sure, is sounding familiar to you. The last couple of things, don't mess with my files. Well, you know, John has a problem facilitating agreement among stakeholders in each department about what the right file plan should be once this stuff is moved into SharePoint, and the process kind of gets bogged down there. The final problem he has is that there's lots of files that can't go into SharePoint. So what do you do with those? Do they stay in the shared drive environment? Does he do something else with them? What is the kind of the right system for these different kinds of files? So I'm sure some of this sounds very familiar. Ultimately, in this project, John runs out of time, and effectively, after doing some basic kind of deduplication and so on, they basically move most of the content from one pile in the shared drive environment to the other. So I wanted to just share that scenario, that fact pattern, which is based on a number of clients that we've worked with to sort of set the stage for the tips, because those are the kind of things that you can expect to find when you tackle a project like this, and I'm sure some of you have already experienced that. So let's talk to our tips for going after those problems. So, you know, one of the biggest issues here is how much can you expect of employees? Oops, sorry, went one too far. How much can you expect of employees when you're doing this project? I mean, the reality is that you have a couple of problems. One is that employees have day jobs, right? And they are really loath typically to spend a lot of time, you know, going through these files. I mean, certainly there's employees that, you know, you have the so-called pilers and the filers, and the people who are filers enjoy it, but their stuff's already organized anyway, so it doesn't really help you much anyways. The other problem you have is that, you know, classifying files is a tricky problem, you know, in the sense that you need to classify files in such a way that they make sense to the users, but they also need to make sense to the organization. So in other words, there has to be an organizational view of what this content is, what its value is, and what the requirements are for its management, so that your content can be managed consistently across the organization. So that's tricky. So the good news is that when you're talking about departmental drives, and certainly those ones that are heavily used, we can learn a lot from how a group of people thinks about their information. Even if it's not perfect, even if it's a little bit messy, the fact that people are using a file plan, however rough that might be, is a good guide for us as we try and develop the file plan we want to use, whether that continues to be in the shared drive in the form of a folder structure, or whether that's metadata that we attach to files as they go into an ECM system. So this is, often the biggest barrier, and I think that it's, and we'll talk about in the next one, there's ways around it. I think that we have smart process, we have smart technology that can help eliminate that burden, that reliance on employees to do mass classification as part of a migration project. It's very difficult to expect that. It's usually not very successful to expect that to happen unless you're talking about a relatively small amount of information. Smart technology, there's little question that machine-based learning technologies are the way that we're going to solve this problem moving forward. I like to say that, computers created this problem for us, which isn't entirely true, but they created this problem. They're going to get us out of this problem, and the problem being massive amounts of unmanaged content. As I talked about in tip number one, humans aren't very good at doing this. Humans are experts on the business function of the information they create, because they created it for a purpose and they understand that, but they're not very good at, I think, at classifying information with an organizational view, at least not outside of a formal program that uses smart technology to aid in it. So I think that machine-based learning technology is essential. It needs to be a part of your arsenal as you go after this problem. It's a perfect problem in many ways for this technology, auto classification technology that can be used to recognize documents and classify them into a file plan that you've created. The thing that we need to be prepared for in using this technology, and this is our experience with it, is it's very powerful, but it's not push-button operation, right? It doesn't sing and dance without some real work and expertise behind using it and configuring it and making it part of a smart process. So you need to look at these technologies. You need to incorporate them if you're undertaking a shared drive cleanup or migration project of any size. I just wanted to quickly share with you some other results from our survey that we did late last year. And we asked, in the same survey where we asked about duplicate and outdated content, we asked our respondents, well, what do you think about these technologies? Do you think that we're going to see widespread use? Is it something you're planning on using? And you can see the results here that there's the majority see it as being part of the way we manage information in the future. You can see here we had 45% said not for 3 years or more. Now, a lot of the people, I found the results of this actually quite interesting. A lot of the people who responded to this survey were lawyers and people in that side of the house, and they tend to be more conservative, which the reason I say it's interesting is that actually the most common and widespread use of this technology is in the legal world, right, for solving kind of a similar problem, which is taking a big body of content and trying to, in a fairly fast fashion, put that content into buckets that represent various topics and represent content that's responsive to a matter or not. And that's where most of these products have been commercialized to date, and now attention is certainly shifting to the proactive or information management side of the house. So, I think there's some validation here that there's a growing appetite for use of auto-classification or machine-based learning technology. Here are the top barriers that our survey respondents identified: complexity, internal cultural opposition, lack of buyer awareness, products not ready. So, as I said, it's not push-button operation. There's very powerful tools out there, but like any powerful tool, you need to know how to use it, and that takes some investment on your part. The third element here, the third tip, is that, shared drives are obviously a very rudimentary content management environment. They don't offer us much in the way of control or enforcement of policy or even basic content collaboration capabilities like version control and so on. There's many great content management and collaboration environments out there that provide wonderful features to help us not only manage information, but do the most important thing of all, which is actually use the stuff to run our business. So when you're doing a migration project, I think it's you need to think about how can we populate these files with metadata that's really going to make the information sing and dance once it gets into the content management system. So, that's a process of educating yourself on the capabilities of the environment you're moving to, identifying what are the dials and levers that you need to set in that environment, and then what can you do as part of the migration process to help that content management system really have value once you move the content there. And Mark, I was just going to ask you, do you see your clients doing this? I mean, what are the most common kind of metadata that they're thinking about when they migrate content through a content management system?
Yeah, this is definitely something that comes up in all of our migration projects, and it's really about helping understand how things are stored in the shared drive and what the limitations have been because that environment is so flat, and then understanding what the new ECM system provides in terms of potential, and trying to align those. So part of the consulting and part of that effort that we'll do is actually work with the organization to look at the target system, look at the content types that they have back in the shared drive, and set up those identify the metadata elements, as well as do the actual classification and start tagging those to the file. So that's it's really seen as a high-value part for any content that's heading towards an ECM system.
Well, I suppose what it does as well is it really helps to justify the investment, or makes the business case for the content for the ECM system, right? Because it really demonstrates what increased value of a collaboration management perspective you're going to get from the environment, right?
And that's a lot of the conversation is around, you bought into the concept of the ECM system because it was going to do all of this for you, all of these features. But if you don't tag the content appropriately, then it, like you said, it can't sing and dance. It can't come to life in that new target system. So they really want to maximize, get all of the applicable metadata on those files so that they're getting all the value out of that target system.
Yeah. Well, great. So our fourth tip is to align your file plans with ID requirements. Now, I mean, those of you who have kind of follow us in our world and my world know that, we tend to have a very risk-focused practice. And in other words, we would, this is kind of in our DNA that, of course, when we think about reorganizing a shared drive, and cleaning it up, or moving it to an ECM, one of the top-level issues is going to be, let's make sure that this aligns with our retention schedule, that it aligns with our information security, information protection, classification levels, and all of the other kind of controls and drivers that we have on a given piece of information. But often we find that these projects are IT-driven, and that's not front of mind for IT professionals. That's changing. I think there's more multidisciplinary expertise being brought to these projects, but often, as I said in our little scenario at the beginning, this is often viewed as an IT project. We're implementing ECM. That's the project, and so these kind of considerations often are not considered, or even just paid lip service to, and I think that's a mistake. You clearly, file plans, or whatever you want to call them. There's, people call them different things, but effectively our basic organizational structure for information is, in a shared drive environment, of course, is represented by the folders and their hierarchy and content management systems. Sometimes there's folders, sometimes it's metadata that's represented through tags and other visual structures. But devising that plan, that hierarchy, that organizational structure is critical, and I think it has to be aligned with the other requirements around that information. So typically the file plan, the chief driver is, let's organize it in a way that makes sense to the people using the information, and I think that's smart. But we also need to think about records retention requirements, privacy, confidentiality requirements, intellectual property, sensitivity, protecting that content, and then, of course, preserving that content in the face of litigation and other formal proceedings. So, so there's a couple of ways to go about it. The one that I like is that you have a file plan or a presentation to the user that most reflects their world, so that they see themselves in that world. We'll talk about that in a second. And they can use the information really easily. And then behind the scenes, you've got that mapped to these other requirements that are less relevant to an employee. An employee doesn't really care about a retention period and some of these other drivers. They just want to do their work, right? But enforcing and connecting those rules behind the scenes is very powerful, and I think should be a goal if you're planning on migrating to a content management system. So, Mark, in terms of these kind of projects, do you see them typically being IT-led, and how do your clients address these kind of requirements?
Yeah, that's interesting. So many of the projects, we often come into play when the SharePoint project or the ECM project is underway, in which case there's a team already in place that is supporting and rolling out that project, but they may not be the entire team that would be required to take a look at things once we get in the mix and we start to ask some of these questions. So usually we're coming in and shedding some light on what are some of the additional areas that we need to consider as part of that migration on the real information management and the metadata, the folder structures, and how those are going to map, even on the disposition processing, because that's a big part of what we often do as part of our project is when we're moving from shared drives to ECM, we don't necessarily want to take everything in, so we'll need to pull in other folks as we do our disposition processing to identify the files that are out of date and have no value to go into the ECM system. We'll help build on that team and help the team that's in place understand, okay, who else needs to be drawn into the mix so that we're able to cover up all of these issues that need to be addressed.
Do you ever run into resistance from, you know, if it's primarily perceived as an IT project, do you have project runners kind of resist the complexity, or do they feel like you're just introducing needless complexity into the process? Is that something you run into?
That's interesting. For someone to really buy into what we do, there needs to be an appreciation for the records management and information management side of things, for sure. Right. Most of our projects have some degree of representation and appreciation for that going in. And we build on that and broaden that to help them understand the full scope of what we're doing. But by all means, if there's not a foundation of records management and information management built into that, say if it's a SharePoint rollout or an ECM deployment, if there's not that fundamental, then the value that this true cleanup and classification and all the information management value can get overlooked, definitely. Right.
Yeah, we find that as well. I guess I should hustle up here. I'm only halfway through. So let's go on to number 5. I mentioned this in the last tip, but this is the way I like to characterize it. Like, is make sure that users see themselves in the file plan. I think one of the biggest mistakes that we've made in the information management space is creating retention schedules that serve the organization's needs and then imposing them down onto employees without any consideration as to whether those classifications, those categories make sense to the employee. And in fact, often they don't. They're not designed to make sense to the individual employee. So often the problem you have is that a knowledge worker can't see where they fit into that scheme, and so it provides no value from a day-to-day getting my job done perspective. So when you develop file plans, it's critical that employees see themselves, that the way they work, the kind of stuff they create is reflected in that file plan. So that's about creating an efficient process through your project to make sure that you get feedback and input from departmental users as you build out the structure that you're going to create in your reorganized environment or in your ECM system. And there's lots of good ways to do that, which I'm not going to talk about in detail. Number 6, again, often in these projects that tend to be IT-led, people like me and my consultants start to come in and wave their arms and say, look, you can't just start deleting this stuff, and it causes a bunch of friction, and no one really budgeted the time to deal with this. But the reality, of course, is that we can't just start deleting information willy-nilly. There's at least 4 different questions that you need to be able to answer before deleting a file. And I don't think that, there's a reasonable level of certainty that you need on these questions. I don't think it needs to be a categorical yes. I think there needs to be a level of comfort with the legal staff and the business side on these questions when you answer them. But minimally, you have to be able to answer, is this file I'm looking at something that's responsive to a lawsuit? If so, it may need to continue to be preserved. You need to answer, is it unique? If it's not unique, that often gives us, greater leeway to get rid of it because it's stored somewhere else, or the copy that we consider to be the record, the thing that we're going to manage, is stored somewhere else, so we can get rid of this one. Is there a statutory requirement to keep it? That's your typical retention period, and is there a business purpose for keeping it? So those questions need to be answered, I think, for the content that you're considering deleting, answered in a fairly definitive or at least a reasonably certain manner so that you can move forward with deletion without creating problems on the legal and business side. Particularly when it comes to information that's responsive to a lawsuit, I think we probably all understand what the stakes are there, and they're very high, and we need to be, very careful. I talked about, I showed you these stats up front, but again, I wanted to emphasize that, we need to really, I think, expend considerable effort in making sure we're cleaning up the stuff that really has no value to us. So the typical candidates for that are the duplicate content, and even that can be tricky because, without going into the weeds on it too much, we have this problem where simply because a file is a duplicate doesn't mean that it's something we can get rid of. In other words, different departments in an organization might keep the same content, might be required to keep the same content for different periods of time because of a legal requirement. So, the fact that the bits are the same doesn't mean that the business and legal requirements for that content are the same, so just getting rid of duplicates can be tricky. But duplicate files are obviously a great candidate, non-business files, and then the stuff that is outdated content. The non-business stuff is really common in shared drives, particularly in the sort of the personal drives that most employees have. So last few tips. Provide the policy foundation. So, I alluded to this in the case study at the beginning, which is, often a big problem that emerges in these projects is that, these decisions about what to keep, what to throw away, and how to organize it, and who has authority to make those decisions, those come to light mid-project, and by then there's no time to deal with them. So, I advise that clients try and get the policy house in order as soon as possible. Many companies have policies that have rules that will help decision making in these projects, but often they're out of date and they need to be brought up to date. They need to be revisited so that you do have authority to make these decisions as you go through your shared drive project. And these are, you see here on the slide, some of the typical kind of policies that you probably need. Number 9, project governance. So again, I alluded to that problem in the case study at the beginning, which is often a big problem here is that nobody actually has authority to make decisions about what to do with content, or it's not clear who has the authority, and that's kind of the same thing, right? Or everyone's responsible, right? So nobody's responsible. So in other words, when building out kind of the project governance for your project, make sure that you address this. Make sure that there's a clear line of authority on making disposition decisions, reorganization decisions, about making all the hundreds of decisions that you're going to make through a project like this that have an impact beyond simply the IT factors in the project. So I'd say this is definitely one of the most common points of failure, and it it's not surprising because in general most companies have done a poor job of creating a corporate governance structure around the management of information. So often you're operating in that larger environment, which provides which is a problem that you can't necessarily solve as part of your project, but you need to try and address it. The last tip is, I think a self-evident one, but one that we need to remind ourselves of over and over when we tackle this project is that, we are touching an environment that most employees probably use on a daily basis. So it's not to be taken lightly. It can be a complex IT project if we're migrating to an ECM, but it's also a complex project from a business and from a cultural perspective. So we need to bring all the tools in our bag, all the change management and communication tools in our bag to bear on this. If we don't, what happens when users to work the day after the migration, the file and grind to a halt. We need to up front. So those are 10 tips we developed on kind of capture the primary themes that we see when we undertake a project like this. I hope you found those useful. We also a white paper that goes in more detail. We'll talk about that at the end of our session. And I'm going to turn it over to Mark at this point.
Thanks, Barclay, and thanks for going over those points. It really hits home because that's where we at Perram have been living and working and breathing for the past 10 years or so. Is this shared drive problem. And I guess the biggest point to make is it's not one problem. It's a bunch of problems moving around that we need to try to get a handle on. And you did a good job of covering those off. On the technology side, there's certainly a bunch of pieces of technology or bits of functionality that are required when you're looking at cleaning up the shared drives. Anything from how we're going to analyze the files that are out there, decide on deduping, how we're going to find what the duplicates are, right through to indexing, developing classification maps and file maps, and then migration. So in terms of technology, there's just on that bit alone, there's a lot of variables involved in a project. On the information governance side, like you said, what are the rules that we need to play by? Who are the roles within the organization that need to be involved so that we can actually action the good work that can be done as part of a project? Wrapping all of this into a process that makes sense to representatives from the business is one of the biggest challenges, so that they can review the folder structure that we're heading to, review how things are being mapped, give us some comments and get some feedback along the way. So we don't want to do this completely in isolation. It's something that needs to have feedback from the business users so that when it hits, it's useful to them. And that's something, another important part of that process. And then the change management aspect is one of the most important things that our clients see in what we do is how we actually facilitate the change. So if we're going from shared drives to SharePoint, how do we actually help the users with that change when they come in on a Monday morning and their content's in a different location? So for the past, like I said, close to 10 years, we've been working on this very specific issue or sets of issues, and we've put together a project process branded under the Parallel name, Parallel process, that really addresses all of this. So we don't sell technology, we don't license out software, we don't come in and address one little bit of this. We really have wrapped it up in an entire project process where we can come in and take an organization from a state of disorganization in the shared drives to organized, migrated, disposition, duplicates gone, all of that, all within one project. How do we do it? A lot of people want to know very early on in learning about this type of an approach is how do you actually determine where the files should go? And like Barclay said, we can't ignore the technology that's out there. There's so much happening in terms of machine-based learning, machine processing, indexing the content. And our approach is really, it's a semi-automated approach where we use the technology that's available to it's the best of the ability right now that's out there. And we also use real live human beings that are classification experts that all day what they do is they work and they classify content, and they help drive the software that helps find the files their home within new systems. So it's really a combination of those two things. It's the technology and it's real live human classifiers that are working together in this project process, which is going to get feedback from the right folks at the right time to keep everyone in the loop as to how things are moving forward. On the technology side, Perram has developed a parallel classifier as our software suite. And it covers things from the capture of content, because one of the important things we need to do is create a mock or an offline environment. We certainly don't want to be working with the files in the live shared drive. So we do a capture, an analysis of the file types. We actually create mapping in terms of where a file should be mapped into a new folder structure, and then disposition, processing, and migration. We have all of those software bits that our people use, our classification experts use. And then on the client side, we have our parallel portal, which is a web portal, and it's really a window into this classification environment so that representatives from the project team can log in and view their content, or a representation of their content. It's not actually their files, but a representation of those files and how they're being mapped. So they can help us make decisions on how are we going to handle duplicates, give us some additional context about some files or folders that we may find that may not have much context to assist with the mapping. And they can actually fully test drive the mapping of content from the legacy structure to this new target structure in this offline environment and give us complete feedback. So it really takes the surprises out of this process, and it opens it up for communication. Then once everyone's happy and we migrate the content, the portal also provides that change management facilitation. It's opened up to all of the users within the organization that are impacted by the project, and it shows them, it allows them to browse the content the way they used to in their legacy shared drive, and then click and it'll show them where it's been mapped to in the new target location, be it a structure in an ECM system in another shared drive or SharePoint. So it really completes that change management process for the users. So certainly over the past 7 years or so, we've developed a lot of proprietary technology here to assist with this shared drive classification effort. Quickly, I want to run you through what a project looks like, because how long does a project take? How many files are we doing? That sort of thing. A particular project for us, a parallel project, usually involves a subset of content and a subset of users for the organization. So we don't come in and attempt to classify all of the content within a shared drive at one go. We'll break it up into some sort of logical grouping based on what the content type is and who those users are. So a sub-project will look something like this. We'll take a look at the content. We'll do some analysis on that content. So understand what the file types are, what the ages are. Are there databases and other file types up on the shared drive that it wouldn't make sense to move, either because it might break something that's linked to it, or simply don't belong in SharePoint or an ECM system? So we'll do that sort of analysis up front in terms of what are we up against. The next step is the development of that target folder structure. So that may come from an organization may come in having a fairly good layout already in terms of what their, if it's functional, what their function and business activities are. But inevitably, we have some role to play here, and it's different for every client. But inevitably, the content drives additional folders. Most of our clients, when they attempt to build the folder structure in isolation from the content, they don't realize that 5 years ago they used to do some different things and they had some different types of content. So once we actually get into the weeds on the content side, it bubbles up. Okay, we need some additional folders in this format to house and file all of the content into. The mapping is the heart of the project, and that's where we're working in the offline environment. Here we go. We're working in the offline environment, and we're finding everything its home. So we're migrating, or sort of not migrating, but we're mapping things from the legacy structure into this new folder structure. And this is a matter of weeks or months. And it's a time when our folks, our classification experts, are going to have some interaction through the portal with members of the project team on the client side. Once in the next step, the validation step, once the client has had a chance to fully test drive this offline mapping and they're happy with it, we come in and we actually do the migration, and we use that file map that we've created to move the files around. A number of things can happen during that migration. So disposition processing, so files that have been identified and reported on in terms of how those files align with the retention schedules of the organization, and those retention schedules that have been approved, disposition reports that have been approved. We'll segregate that content out. So at migration time, we'll create separate folders to say, okay, here's all of the content that's due for disposition. We're not going to migrate it anywhere. We're just going to leave it here, queued up for bulk deletion, archive, or transfer, depending on the disposition method. And then as part of that migration, some content might go into a new folder structure in the shared drive. Some might go into SharePoint. Some might go into OpenText or Documentum or FileNet. So it can be multiple repository paths, really, depending on the type of content that we find. So there's a lot of options there in terms of where things end up and how they're structured. And the last piece is that change management piece that's helping the organization understand how do they get to this information now that it's been moved around. And that's something we do very well with the Parallel portal. This project, these 6 steps on the screen here, can take place in as little as 8 to 10 weeks. So it's not something that needs to take a year. A sub-project, so if we're looking at a departmental level, a departmental project, we might queue it up for an 8 to 10 week cycle, and then we might have multiple sub-projects going on at the same time. So certainly not something that needs to take a tremendous amount of time, and because we're bringing in all of the technology and our folks, our classification experts know how to use it, obviously, there's no learning curve. When the project starts, we're hitting the ground running, and we're starting to process content. So just to wrap that up, the real technical bits of the project offering that we offer and the technical bits that Barclay spoke to are largely around trying to get the folder structure correct in terms of what's the target, understand what that looks like, and how metadata might be involved in that as well. Classifying the content, getting everything into the right location, understanding what's no longer due or should be kept, so how can we run disposition processing, and then the actual migration. Those are the real technical bits of our approach to a project. But by far the overarching theme that we include in our project process is really all about the adoption of the new technology. So if it's SharePoint, it's about how are users going to work in SharePoint, and how are we going to ensure that once the content is moved, they're able to find it and they're comfortable within that new environment. And it's about getting the record management policies into action, because our clients, prior to working with us, they usually have policies, but because the shared drive is such an unwieldy environment to work against, they've really had no way to put those into action and get things organized and put some content lifecycle management on content within the shared drive. So those are the real themes of what we do. It's about getting those RM policies off the shelf and on top of the content, and it's about helping the organization move forward with their ECM or SharePoint deployment. So at this point, let's take a quick time check. We're coming up to the hour. I'm going to pop into the questions and see if we have anything in there that we should address. And I see there are a couple of questions. We have a question. Are the slides going to be available after the presentation? Yes, we will. As Barclay mentioned, we have a couple of follow-ups with the white paper, which is essentially the slide deck with a little more meat to it. So it's the full explanation of the webinar. So there will certainly be some takeaways that we can provide. I have a question for organizations with immature or non-existing information governance. Is that a huge barrier to the cleanup process? And how do you solve this? So this is a good question. So if all of the information governance pieces aren't in place, where do we start? And from the Perram point of view, there are some things we can do that don't require all of the information governance piece. So we can do some analysis, we can do some deduplication type work, but certainly together with Barclay and ViaLumina and Perram is something that we can certainly provide guidance on in terms of developing retention schedules and getting the tools in place that we'll need to be able to work against.
I think it's a good question, Mark, because the reality is that, of course, most of the companies we both work with don't have a perfect information governance program. It's, in real life, this stuff is you put in an fashion and, you forward as far as you can. So, I don't think a lot of our tips focus on the things you need to have in place ideally to make a project successful. In real life, we don't always have that luxury in the environment all the time.
Exactly. I have a couple of more questions here, Barclay.
Okay.
Do you have a recommendation for who should be in charge or have the authority, I guess, on the information governance side? I'll turn that one over to you, Barclay.
Well, it's actually one of my favorite topics, and I have sort of a whole spiel around that and a lot of thought. But the short answer is I think ideal role for the CIO, and at most companies I think the most sense. The reality is that, however, the CIO in many companies doesn't want the job, right? My glib sort of statement about that is that information, for her title, most CIOs see information as a problem, rather infrastructure is a problem. But I think that that's changing. I think that this is a great opportunity for CIOs to take on leadership in this. So we're seeing that with our clients. We're seeing leak, of course, a bigger role as I think our functions, well, as the knowledge gained on the litigation side, which is typically knowledge of how awful information governance is, as that makes over to the more proactive or the side of legal that's the business. Legal professionals take leadership role here too. I don't think it matters. There's no right answer. It depends on the culture of your company. What does matter is that has that authority, and very difficult to make information governance without that. And I think just I think that's a big reason as to why we are where we are, which most of us have done a poor job around management information.
Thanks, Barclay. A couple more questions here before we wrap up. This one's an interesting one. Is there a checklist available that could help in developing shared drive guidance for business areas? And that's a great question. It's something that, as part of our projects, what we develop is something called a style guide. And a style guide is something that can be used internally to help users understand what's the appropriate use of naming conventions largely within the shared drive. So what are the use of caps and what are the use of abbreviations, date formats, things like that. Beyond that, so those are some of the superficial but important things that need to be addressed, because having 10 different date formats on folders is not great. But beyond that, it tends to be specific to the organization in terms of the actual guidance, in terms of how to file things moving forward. I think that might have been the nature of the question. And we and I'm sure ViaLumina has played a role in those sorts of guidance, the documents as well. And I think that's important. It's certainly more important if we're looking at cleaning up and keeping content in the shared drive, because we're making an effort to move things forward, but we don't have all of the controls of an ECM environment where we can lock things down and control how the users interact with the folders and files. So there is definitely a place and a need to do some internal training. Any thoughts on that, Barclay?
Nothing really additional. I think if the question was, do we have anything publicly available? We don't. It's actually a good idea, though. It's something that maybe would be a good topic for a blog post. We'll give that some thought.
All right. One question here. Is Parallel Classify software a custom solution, or is it built off of other vendor solutions? So that's a great question as well. So yes, it's a proprietary software. So Perram has been developing the Parallel software suite for, like I mentioned, about 7 years now. And there's a number of different modules that make up the software to address all of the real specific issues that we need to address. In addition to that, there's also integration available for other indexing and auto-categorization tools that you might have. So if there's already something in-house that you've been using, there's certainly the ability to tie that into our process. So you can think of it really as it's an envelope that can really take on additional technology as well. So if there's already a platform in-house, we can wrap our process around that as well. So a good question here. Can you speak about some of the business types with which you've worked? Give some examples, aerospace, defense, securities, and how to address the varied business types. So traditionally, Perram has done a lot of work in the government space, as well as the Fortune 500, I guess is the best way to put it. So the largest organizations that are most sensitive to the information management and the litigation issues. And we find that because the classification work that we do is 90% of it by function of the organization is similar, HR, finance, as we move through. And then really we're dealing with the core function of the organization that's going to be unique. we build up subject matter expertise with our people on those core subjects. So that knowledge we gain about an industry or a vertical can be reused. Barclay, I know that you've done a diverse work as well.
Yeah, we've done most major industries. Energy, oil, and gas certainly is. We've done a lot of work in that space. Services is another big sciences. I sense is that those sectors are very heavy users of shared drives for one reason or the other, and also a lot of data. We have a lot of regulatory requirements. That kind of drives interest in our services. Usually when we're working on this project of building or improving an overall information governance program. So frankly, most of those today are by negative events occurred. That's what if you will. That means that heavily regulated industries and those that experience lots of litigation traditionally been our client base. That's interesting. Actually, in the last or so, we've done a lot of work construction with construction companies. That's kind of new for us. They're also very interesting in the sense that all their work is based, so that adds challenges to this process. Also because you've got these really definite ending events and most of the work, which makes up an organization a little bit easier.
There's one more question that I want to address, and then we'll wrap things up. And it's a good one as well. It's essentially around recognizing that together with automation and human eyes, there still needs to be some blanket decisions that are being made, or some risk management in terms of how much effort are we going to put into reviewing and analyzing all of this content. Jimmy, any thoughts there to kind of a risk-based approach, Barclay, in terms of how much effort you put on different types of content or different parts of the organization?
Yeah, so in any information governance project that we take on that involves significant change management, we tend to pilot whatever we're doing. So whether it's a migration, whether it's a cleanup project, whether it's just implementing policies and some training, we pilot all of that as a whole and typically try and do it first in the non-revenue generating parts of the business. HR is a really common starting point, simply because not that it's not important that everybody gets paid, and so you don't want to mess with that, but you have a little more leeway often in HR than some of the other groups to try out some of the stuff. The other side of that is that if you're successful there, of course, HR touches every part of the business, so they can become a good advocate for the project. So that's kind of one thought on how we sort of stage these things. When the other side is that, yes, we do always take a risk-focused or adjusted approach. In other words, identify the areas of the business that kind of on a sliding scale that represent the greatest or have the greatest risk profile, and on down, and that's usually some combination of what their specific business activities are, the kinds of information to generate, the volumes of information, their litigation history, and then the regulatory regime that applies to them, and then focus on those areas first, and that's very typical for us. So, in regulated sectors, that's fairly easy. Outside of that, like I say, in construction, for example, where we did quite a few projects last year, I mean, that's interesting because you have not a specific regulatory requirement, but you have these interesting litigation patterns, like litigation over the completion of a factory or of an industrial complex where there's a final holdback payment, and litigation often commences over that, and sometimes it's just a strategy to delay that final payment. So, you know, we focused in on that problem as a place to provide immediate value, because, and what we enabled our clients to do is to actually nip that litigation in the bud by being able to very quickly respond to the complaint by the owner, the client, to demonstrate that their claims were false and to basically prevent the litigation from progressing and therefore get the money in the bank sooner. So, and that's an example just fresh in my mind of where we focused on a particular area that had risk associated with it but also had tremendous value. You know, getting $50 million, you know, 2 years earlier is a pretty high value proposition. So yeah, I mean, risk, weighting things by risk and going after those processes or parts of the business is, I think, a good idea.
All right, thanks, Barclay. I think I'm checking the questions. I think we're all caught up, and I think we're just over time as well. So I think we better wrap it up there. But I will reiterate that the material that you've seen today will be available in a white paper format and will be coming your way. So keep an eye out for that. We appreciate everyone's attendance. And if there's further questions that can be addressed, feel free to get in touch with us, and we'd be glad to continue the discussion. But I think we'll wrap it for there, unless there's anything final that you wanted to say, Barclay.
No, that sounds good. I appreciate everyone joining, and I hope you value in it. Thank you.
Very good. Okay, thanks. Have a good day, everyone. Bye-bye.